I can't explain it, but the butterflies seem to know where the bodies are. I've been a park ranger since I was 18. After 5 years, I really can't imagine doing anything else. I was in the Scouts when I was younger, and have been an avid hiker all my life. Time spent in the woods is time well spent, and the ability to work there every day is absolutely a dream come true for me. Being a park ranger, you see your fair amount of bodies in the woods. People come out here to hike and swim and forget that there are things here that will kill you. They run afoul of animals, they get sucked into the rapids, they don't pack enough food or water, and they just get lost and aren't found till someone chances upon them. Spring 2023 was the year that we got some help from the butterflies. It started with the death of Angel Myers, but it certainly didn't end there. Angel Myers was what you would call a minimalistic camper. She would come in with a few essentials, just kind of camp wherever she decided to drop down. She knew which plants would kill her and which ones would nourish her, which was good. She also knew which plants would get her higher than airplane wings, which was bad. We had called the cops on Angel several times, but they always cut her loose a few days later, and the rangers refused to toss her a lifetime ban from the park, and she just kept coming back. When a pair of hikers told us they had found a body in an area we knew as the Meadow, we supposed this would be the last time we had to call the cops on her. She was naked, and it wasn't the first time many of us had seen her in this state. She wasn't bad to look at, but it's always a little weird to find someone stark naked in the elements. She was splayed out, spread eagle, in the flowers that grew in the meadow, and her eyes and tongue were missing. That wasn't terribly uncommon either, not with all the varmints in the park, but the little black growths on her skin were definitely something I'd never seen before. She had 3 rows of perfect little spikes, each of them about 3 inches long, and each line about 9 spikes long. Other than the spikes, the strangest part of the whole scene was the butterflies. They weren't a species I was familiar with, and they were bone white with light black patterns on their wings. They were thick over the body, and I assumed that they had been what had drawn the hikers. They were circling in a cloud, the white easily seen against the green canopy around them, and I was as amazed by them as I was the weird protrusions on her skin. "What the hell are these?" I asked, reaching out a finger to test if they were sharp, but finding them squishy and full of green liquid instead. "Pallida morse," Rico, one of the other rangers I worked with, said. "One more time in English for the rest of us," I said. "Pale death," he said, pointing to the butterflies. "They're rare. I don't think I've seen one in the flesh. They're supposed to live in the deep woods, and they only come out every few years to lay eggs." I pointed to the little row of spikes running up her thigh. "On corpses?" Rico nodded. "That's why they call them Pallida morse. They lay eggs on corpses, though it's usually of animals. I've heard of them laying eggs on human bodies, but it's rare. I guess they found the corpse before we did." The hikers said about the same thing when we questioned them. They'd been hiking to the meadow, his fiancée wanting to see it in the spring, and as they came to the end of the trail, she had noticed the swarm of pale butterflies and wanted a closer look. She had thought they were pretty, but as she got that closer look, they'd seen the body and realized they were swarming around it. We called the station and got some guys from the coroner's office down to pick her up. We hoped she would somehow be the last body we found that spring, but I think even then, I knew it wouldn't be the last body I saw taken out of the park that year. The next one was a hiker named Marcus Dre, and his death was truly terrible. Some campers had gone fishing in the Connoisseur River, the waterway that runs through the park, and as they chased the trout that were beginning their journey to the spawning ground, one of their kids came across a grisly sight. He said it looked like a scaled claw was sticking out of the river, and he ran to his mother thinking it was a monster. She had expected to find a rock formation or maybe a stick with some moss on it. But what they found was an arm covered in the black spike pods the butterflies leave behind. "They looked like scales," the mother had said, still a little shaken by the experience, and I could understand why he thought it was a monster's hand. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized the arm was jutting up from the foam. At first, we thought the guy had just fallen into the river and gotten stuck behind the rocks after drowning. When we pulled him out, however, we got a better idea of the extent of the damage. Somehow, he had been forced into a small space between the two rocks, and they hadn't done it gently. His shoulders were broken, like snapped in the middle and just folded up. He was crumpled up like a suit coat in the hole, and that wasn't all. Something had eaten his face. Not like Angel, where the eyes and tongue were missing. They had eaten his entire face off, skinned him down to the skull, and there was nothing left but ragged flesh and scored white bone. If it hadn't been for the arm sticking up, we might have never found him until someone panning for minerals had found a skull or a finger. The butterflies, the pale death, had presided over everything as we managed to get him onto the shore. After that, we found 4 more bodies in a month. One was left on a mountainside, its hands missing and its nose and lips chewed off. He'd been climbing the low-grade mountain that we have on the grounds, and when he'd gone missing, we thought he might have been in a small avalanche due to the snowmelt. When a fisherman found him laid out on the lowest peaks, however, we knew it was something much worse. The second was a woman who'd gone into the woods to relieve herself during a picnic, and was found in the low branches of a tree. Well, half of her was. The other half was high up in the tree, and something had eaten her legs. The husband had to be hospitalized after he identified the top half of his wife, and I felt bad for the kids. They'd been here to enjoy a picnic in the park, and something had taken that away from them. The third was, unfortunately, a child named Caitlin Mills. Caitlin would have been 6 in July, but she never got the opportunity. Caitlin was the strangest, and also the easiest to identify. Caitlin had left her parents' campsite in the night, but it appeared that whatever had found her had taken an interest in her. Something had taken care of her in the woods. Something had fed her. Something had changed her clothes. Something had made sure she drank clean water, and then, unfortunately, its care had lapsed. Caitlin hadn't died because her face had been eaten off. She had died because her skull had connected with the ground and cracked. It was pretty clear that she had fallen out of a tree, but the coroner said that she would have needed to fallen from a pretty steep height. She was stretched out, too, as if something had made her comfortable as she lay dying. The fourth was the worst, and the reason for what came after. The fourth was Ranger Franklin Carpenter, and he'd gone missing after going to check one of the pump stations. We had 6 pump stations, things we used to bring clean water to the campsites, and he'd been responding to a call about a malfunction in Station 4. He had gone out before lunch, and we found what was left of him the next day, after he never came back. If he hadn't died wearing his name tag, then we wouldn't have known who it was. His arms and legs were missing, and believed to have been eaten. His face was gone, as was the top of his skull and what lay within. Something had gnawed his chest, eaten his buttocks, chewed his genitals off for good measure. It was just a torso and part of a head when we found him on the edge of the woods, and a lot of us got pretty scared after losing one of our own like that. Over all 4 bodies, the butterflies held sway, and their eggs were in evidence. I expected a visit from the head ranger, but when he arrived with a man in a black suit the next day, we should have known that something was about to happen. He had a few other men in similar attire, and Rico lifted an eyebrow as we took our seats at briefing. None of these guys were dressed for more than a slow stroll over a concrete path, but I doubted that was their intention. Agent Lee has been gracious enough to come and help us with our problem. We'll be splitting into groups so you can canvass the woods. We need to find whatever is doing this before summer starts, especially with one of our own being a recent casualty. We have a lot of ground to cover, so Rangers will be splitting up with 2 of Agent Lee's boys to show them the trails and help them bring this to a close. So that's how I found myself in the woods with Agent Feist and Agent Martin. Agent Lee might have looked like an investment banker, but these two had traded their Brooks Brothers suits for camo and assault rifles. We had broken out shotguns that we used to put off angry wildlife to supplement the firepower that the agents had brought, and the three of us proceeded through the woods. Agent Feist wasn't a big talker, but Agent Martin made up for it by asking questions about what we had seen. I told him about the bodies, the parts that had been eaten, and the butterflies that seemed to hover around everything. "Butterflies?" Feist said, and it was probably the only thing I'd heard him say in the hour that we'd been walking. "Yeah, Rico calls them something in Latin that basically means pale death. They show up around the bodies and just kind of mark where they are." Feist gave Martin a look, and the two nodded knowingly. "Have you seen anything near the sites? Footprints or scales, maybe. Stuff like insect skin?" I shook my head. "No, mostly just dead people." I was preparing to ask them what they thought they were looking for, since they clearly knew something, when we came through a dense stand of trees and into an open space that was anything but open. It seemed infested with the pale butterflies, and as we stalked in, they fluttered around us almost gladly. The two agents took this as a good sign, but weren't sure what to think. These things had been a pretty foul omen in the last few months, and finding a huge number of them now seemed less than ideal. As we moved into the cloud of butterflies, it also seemed like something was stalking us. Through the thick waves of insects, there was a large shadow that followed us. It almost appeared human-sized, but the longer I watched it flit through the swarm, it seemed to grow. It may have had as few as 2 arms, or as many as 8, but the wings I saw stir its smaller kin were what worried me. They were tall and white, just like the others, and it seemed to be using them as a blind to lure us in deeper. "It's close," Martin whispered. "Steady," Feist said. "If we spook him, he might fly away before we can take him out." "What?" I half whispered, talking too loud, but too scared to care. Feist looked at Martin, shrugging at something on the other's face. "You've heard of the Mothman. Well, there's a counterpart to that thing. The people of Joplin talk about how many of their children were saved from a tornado by these butterfly people, but they assume those who were lost were taken by that tornado, and not the same creatures who saved them. We call them Lycadia bipoptus, and they are extremely..." But he never got a chance to finish. Suddenly the cloud of butterflies enveloped us, their small bodies clinging to us as they struck. Our vision was cut off, and as the automatic weapons chattered, I hit my belly and started crawling. I wanted to get out of the swarm, to get away from the wild bark of the guns, and as I crawled, I heard somebody yelling. The wet sound of something being torn cut off some of the screaming, but the gunfire persisted as I kept making my way out of the cloud of insects. I kept crawling until I made it out of the clearing. Once I was no longer being buffeted by butterflies, I got up and started running. I could still hear the gunfire behind me, but I knew that what I wanted was to live. I knew that if I stayed, I'd be dead, and I still very much wanted to live. I ran until someone yelled at me to stop and shoved a gun in my face. It was another one of the agents, and as they all coalesced, I was ordered to take them back to the spot where I had left Agent Feist. As little as I wanted to go back, I agreed. By the time I got back, Feist was sitting on something he had covered with a tarp. Feist's left hand was hanging uselessly at his side. His clothes were ripped to shreds, but he was grinning like a big game hunter who'd bagged the big one. "Get it to the truck. Tell the boys back at base I had no choice but to kill it. It refused to come peacefully and forced my hand." Martin was dead, his body covered in a slew of crushed butterflies. I saw him before they could tarp him as well. Something had torn his throat out, and I assumed it was whatever was under the big tarp that Feist was guarding. They took both the tarped bodies away, and when Feist came towards me, I was worried he would be angry that I'd fled. He put a hand on my shoulder instead and nodded in understanding. "Don't feel bad, kid. I would have run too if I'd had the choice. Both Agent Martin and I knew what we were getting into. You got us here. That's what counts." They took it away, and the murders stopped. We lost 2 more hikers that year, but They were both killed by the elements. The butterflies left that same day, never, hopefully, to return. I can't help but think about that spring again, as winter abates and the seasons get warmer. I tell you one thing, I'll be keeping an eye peeled for butterflies from now on. You never know when they, and a new horror, might show up again. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story? Or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Heather for being our Spooky Ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, and Sarah Samar 42 for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, we always tell you to come on down to Patreon or check out my member section on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton contributors get their video 12 hours earlier at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. And Ghostly Readers get a book every time I write one on their doorstep. There's actually one coming up here in a few weeks, so if you'd like to get in on that, please go ahead and sign up. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.